Alrighty guys, so this is going to be hopefully a pretty quick video. I want to get into a new kind of concept that we haven't really talked about too much, but is going to be super useful in just like making games in general, and specifically it's going to help a lot when we are working on our sound effects later. Um, so what we're going to be getting into here is called static managers. They're You may have already worked with projects where you made something called a game controller, or you made a game manager or something like that. And if you weren't using the static keyword in there, which I know if and I'm specifically talking to my 110 students, you maybe weren't using the idea of the static or of the game manager, game controller in the uh, most appropriate way. If you're having one per scene, that's fine, it makes sense, but there are ways that we can go about not needing to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a C# script, and I'm going to call it Game Manager. And when I do that, we're going to see that I jumped right over to Visual Studio. We're going to see that Unity actually, since Game Manager is such a commonly used file, it actually gives us this fancy little gear icon. It's no different than our player controller and our other scripts. They just know that this is a very commonly used script name, and went ahead and gave it, you know, a new icon. So, the first thing I'm going to do with our game manager, I guess what I want to do is take a step back and talk about what the whole point of a game manager is. Game manager, you could have a game manager, a sound manager, input manager, all kinds of managers. The idea of a manager is that it is a resource for all of your other scripts to have access to easily. And by making it static, which we'll get into like how we do that in just a minute, by making it static, it means that we do not have to have a direct reference to that. So if I wanted to, just taking another step back, if I wanted to work with a player controller, I would go public player controller, and go into Unity and drag this into my little slot on whatever game object I put this game manager on, correct? Um, by making this static, you don't have to have any of this foolery. Okay, there are some rules that you have to follow, but the way that you should, by making a game manager static, be able to just call it wherever. Now, there are pros and cons to this, which we'll get into after we get it working, but I can say public static game manager, and I'm going to call it game manager instance. Okay, now you don't need to name it this, but you usually I go ahead and just name them instance. Actually, I think I'm just going to do that because this is going to be a variable that is a reference to the singular instance of our game manager, and that singular part is very important. I'm going to go ahead and put my start back real quick just for a moment. We're not going to do anything with it, but because I have this public static game manager instance, I can go to any of my other scripts and, you know what, let me put a variable on it real quick. I'm just going to say public int, I'm just going to say current level. Okay, current level. If I wanted to, I don't know, have my player controller print out the current level off of my game manager, generally we would have to go up here and say public game manager, game manager instance, like this. And then we'd have to go back over to Unity, and let's just do this real quick. Oh, it looks like I forgot a semicolon. Hold on, give me 1 second. I'm just on my other screen, get this error to go away. Here's our player controller. Generally, we'd have to go and drag the game manager into here. Let's go ahead and make a game manager because we do still need to do that. Game manager. Let's make these windows a little bit better looking. I'm going to add my script to it. Current level, let's just pretend we're on level 2. And generally, now what I'd be able to do is say, let's bring this over here. print game manager instance dot current level, right? Because I'm going to go over to Unity. I'm going to go to my player. Let me rename this player so I quit losing it. I'm going to drag in Game Manager here. And once I hit play, we should see that it's going to print out my text, right? It's going to print out 2 every frame because in update, I have it printing out current level. Now, this is really great and really useful, but let's say, for example, I loaded up a new level and I don't want to have a new game manager in every scene. I would want my one game manager to just rule over the entire game. If I go to a new level, my players I wouldn't be able to drag this into these little instances. So actually, let's do that. Let's go ahead and make a new level. I'm just gonna boop, go to our build settings, and we have our sample scene. I'm going to add this one. Whoop. There we go. And I'm going to save and go into that second sample scene. You can see I don't have a game manager. I'm going to do one very quick code update. Don't have to do this. It's just for me showing it's just for me showing how we're going to solve this issue. Let's say when I press spacebar, since we don't have the jump yet, if you're watching these videos out of order, I'm recording this before we do our raycasting video. I'm going to say scene manager dot load scene 1. Right? So that way then we can load our first or second scene in the build settings. So if I come here and I'm going to go back into here, into our sample scene with the game manager, right now everything will work as intended, right? It'll be just fine. It'll print out 2. But if I press space, you'll see that I start getting a null reference. And that's because the game manager did not follow over here. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, that's okay. You can just put a new game manager into the sample scene. But that's not really the most efficient way to do this, especially if you want to, for instance, carry data across 2 scenes. You may have made games already where I'm going to go ahead and unhit play because these errors are giving me anxiety, where your health, for example, had to go from one scene to another, right? And when you would start in scene 1, level 1, you take some damage, you go to level 2, well, the damage doesn't stay consistent. And that is absolutely normal, right? Like it's because here, let's go. The player I have here is its own unique version of the player that I have right here, right? If I make this, I don't know, red, and I go back, we'll save that. These are obviously 2 different levels, right? It would make sense that their player controller, if I had health on here, for instance, would be completely different. And that's where statics come in. If I go back to my game manager, we made this public static game manager instance, and up to this point, we have not used it at all. The reason is because in order to use it, you have to do 2 things. You can see if I take off the variable that I had over here, this game manager, I get an error, which makes sense. I deleted the variable that I was interacting with here. But if I go game manager, accessing the class itself, dot instance, I should be able to see that it is now getting the static instance of the game manager. Static basically makes it so that way then this lives in like a godlike state. It's like over all the other instanced game objects. It can be accessed by all of them, and it can be it doesn't need to have a direct reference. It can just, other scripts can call out to it, and as long as it's there, because you might get situations where it won't be there, it will be able to supply any information necessary. For example, our current level. So if we go over here to our game, when I go to hit play, uh, that's not ideal. Hold on, let me take a look at this. Ah, I forgot one key part. I apologize for that. We have to say that instance equals this. And we're going to actually come back to this in just a moment because there's more that we have to do into here. But we have to essentially make it clear that the version of this game manager is the instance, right? By default, this doesn't equal anything. It equals null. So as soon as the game manager, spawns into existence, we have to go and say, yes, the static version that every object should be able to reach out to is this script, is this object, is the instance of the game manager, this guy right here. So let's go ahead and hit play now, and hopefully then we won't get this error. There we go. Perfect. You see that's printing out 2. Now, this solved one issue. We no longer have to have the player have a direct reference to our game manager. This is really useful when you don't want to keep making your code more complex and you don't want to have a whole bunch of variables that you drag into here. Okay, so now there is one issue here. The game manager itself will be accessible across various scenes, but not in the most elegant of ways. In order to make this work, we well, actually, let me backtrack just a second. If I go ahead and add this, if input.getKeyDown key code dot, I don't know, let's say F. Let's go back to the first scene. Okay. So let's make this 0. We're going to run into a bit of a problem. So we're here, everything's good. We press spacebar, it's still printing, but when we press F, we'll notice that it's printing faster, I believe. Maybe not. But the core here is we want to be able to keep track of a singular game manager, right? We want this to actually carry through and be accessible by any new objects and for us to be able to actually see it in our hierarchy. There are times where you need to change things on the game manager, or you just want to have a physical representation at the start. At least this is how I go about doing this. It looks like my Visual Studio is having a bit of a problem. Give me just a moment. Had to pause the recording because that took much longer to fix than I thought. The tricky thing with this is you want to ensure that you can actually have a physical representation of your manager in each level and know that you are currently working with the same instance consistently. Because if you aren't, you never know when something can get overwritten. You just want to have tighter control over your game objects and your scripts. So what I generally do is something called a singleton. It says if instance equals null, then we want the instance to equal this. Else, we want to destroy this game object. Now, there is one other thing that we want to do here. We want to say, don't destroy on load this game object, because we want this game object to constantly be around. We saw that going from scene to scene, we still did have access to the game manager script because it had a static reference. It was, just hanging around for us. However, being able to have the physical game object that we can keep track of will be much more useful to us as we're working throughout Unity. Now, obviously, in your build, it's not going to matter that much, but as you're working, it will be much more useful to be able to go to your manager and simply say, oh, hey, that's the one, that's where all my variables are. For example, and the way that you actually go about doing that is we have this don't destroy on load tab right here. And underneath it, what do you know? There's our game manager, right? And if I press spacebar to go to my red room scene, I still have that same game manager. It hung around for us. This is a really great way to keep track of your different game objects. Now, that singleton, I'm going to go back here. It says if the instance that equals null, then the instance equals this. And don't destroy it when we load a new scene. Otherwise, destroy the game object. Without that destroy game object, if I were to go back, I would end up having two game managers here, which is no good, obviously. We don't want that. If I had more concrete, like maybe references to prefabs or stuff like that in here, what would essentially happen is any script that's trying to access this game manager would not know which game manager to go to. And if you generally in your code, you don't want to be changing things on the game manager, but you can if you need to, or you might have different managers interact in ways that your data transmutes a tiny bit. So not being able to keep track of what your current game manager is a fatal flaw when you're designing systems like this. For example, sorry, not an example of that, but an example of another manager that we may end up using is a sound manager where we have a library of all of our sound effects that we can just pull from as we need. But we'll get into that in the sound lecture. Overall, that's pretty much the big thing that I wanted to go over, is how we can have our static global objects like this to pull information from. Obviously, you can do way more than print these, print little messages and whatnot. You can have a access to prefabs or enemies or whatever you need that you can then pull from whenever you need it. Makes it very useful and very easy to just simply grab different objects and not need to have direct references and then worry about losing references in your code base. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments or reach out via Discord. And thanks for watching.